You've probably heard the story. A great flood covers the earth. One family survives by building a boat. Animals are saved, two by two. Everything else is destroyed. You know this is the story of Noah. But here's what almost nobody tells you. The exact same story exists in Mesopotamia, written down over 1,000 years before the Bible was ever compiled. And it doesn't stop there. The Hindu tradition has Manu, warned by a fish to build a boat before the waters rise. Ancient Greece has Deucalion, who survives a flood sent by Zeus. China has Gun Yu, fighting floodwaters for generations. Indigenous nations across North America tell flood stories that long predate any contact with European settlers. So here's the real question. How did civilizations who never met, separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of miles, end up telling almost the same story? For a long time, people assumed there had to be a single explanation, maybe one ancient flood so massive it got remembered everywhere. But when historians and geologists actually looked closely, the answer turned out to be far stranger than that. There wasn't one flood. There were many. And the reason the story repeats isn't because every culture is describing the same event. It's because every culture was living through the same kind of terror, over and over, in different places, at different times. Let's go back to where this story is first written down. In Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, archaeologists uncovered a clay tablet containing the Epic of Gilgamesh. Inside it is a flood story almost identical in structure to Noah's. A god warns one man, Utnapishtim, to build a boat, save his family and animals, and survive a flood meant to wipe out humanity. This text predates the Hebrew Bible by centuries. Assyriologist George Smith first translated this tablet in 1872, and when he realized what he was reading, he was reportedly so stunned he started taking his clothes off in the museum archive. He had just found proof that the flood story didn't start with one culture. It was already old when the Bible was written. So why does this story show up again and again? The geological record actually gives us a clue. The region we now call Mesopotamia sits between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and it has flooded catastrophically, over and over, for thousands of years. Geologist and flood researcher Bruce Mass has studied ancient flood narratives across dozens of cultures and found that many of them cluster around real, datable natural disasters, melting ice age glaciers, tsunamis, and catastrophic river floods that genuinely could have wiped out entire early settlements. Here's the part that changes how you see this. Around 14,000 to 8,000 years ago, the last ice age was ending. Massive glaciers were melting all over the planet. Sea levels rose by more than 120 meters over those millennia. Entire coastlines that early humans had lived on for generations slowly disappeared underwater. If you lived through even a fraction of that, watching the water creep further inland every few decades, swallowing land your grandparents once farmed, you would absolutely tell your children a story about a flood that destroyed the world. Because for your people, in a very real sense, it did. This is where the science gets genuinely fascinating. Different cultures, separated by enormous distances, were independently living through real, regionally devastating floods. Mesopotamia had its river floods. Coastal communities had rising seas. River valley civilizations in China dealt with the Yellow River, which floods so often and so violently that ancient Chinese rulers were judged almost entirely on how well they controlled it, which is exactly the struggle described in the myth of Gun Yu. The myths aren't copies of each other. They're independent responses to a shared category of disaster that almost every early human civilization, no matter where it was, eventually had to survive. Psychologist Carl Jung had a theory about why stories like this take a similar shape across cultures who never met. He proposed that humans share certain deep, universal patterns of thought, what he called archetypes, built from experiences so common to being human that they show up in stories everywhere, even without any contact between the people telling them. A devastating flood that destroys almost everyone, survived by a small group who restart humanity, fits this perfectly. It's not just a memory of an event. It's a near universal human fear given a story to live inside. And there's a second, more practical reason floods specifically became the disaster every culture mythologized. Out of every natural disaster early humans faced, fire, earthquake, drought, famine, flooding is unique in how it interacts with memory and oral storytelling. Earthquakes are sudden and over in seconds. Droughts are slow and don't make for a single dramatic image. But a flood has a clear beginning, a terrifying climax, and survivors who can describe exactly what they saw. The water rising, the animals fleeing, the small group who escaped by boat. That narrative shape is simply easier to pass down accurately for thousands of years, generation after generation, which may be part of why flood stories specifically survived so consistently compared to stories about other disasters. There's also something worth noticing about who survives in nearly every version of this story. It's almost never a king, a warrior, or someone already powerful. It's usually an ordinary person, a farmer, a boat builder, a quiet member of the community, who was warned because they listened, or because they were paying attention when others weren't. Folklorists who study recurring story structures, including work building on Joseph Campbell's research into shared narrative patterns across world mythology, have pointed out that this detail repeats across cultures for a reason that has nothing to do with any single flood and everything to do with what these stories were actually meant to teach. The lesson embedded in nearly every flood myth isn't really about water at all. It's about humility, attentiveness, and the idea that the people who survive catastrophe are rarely the strongest. They're the ones who took a warning seriously when it still seemed unnecessary to. So when you compare the Mesopotamian flood, the Hindu story of Manu, the Greek story of Deucalion, and indigenous flood stories from completely separate continents, you're not looking at one culture borrowing from another, and you're not looking at proof of one literal global flood. You're looking at separate civilizations independently processing the same category of catastrophe, using the same basic narrative structure, because that structure is simply how the human mind organizes a story about near total loss and starting over. It's worth pausing on just how widespread this really is. Among the Anishinaabe and other indigenous nations of North America, oral traditions describe a great flood and a figure, often called Nanabuzu, who survives and helps remake the land, sometimes with the help of animals who dive beneath the water to retrieve mud from which the world is rebuilt. In the highlands of New Guinea, in completely separate oral traditions, communities tell their own distinct flood stories, shaped by their own geography and their own relationship with the rivers and seas around them. These are not variations of a single, shared, original myth. Anthropologists studying flood narratives, including researchers cited in comparative mythology databases like the Berosus Project, generally treat each tradition as its own independent response to local, lived experience of catastrophic flooding, with its own characters, its own lessons, and its own cultural meaning, even when the broad shape of the story looks familiar from the outside. This is an important distinction, because it's tempting to flatten all of these stories into one tidy global pattern. But each tradition deserves to be understood on its own terms, told by its own people, for its own reasons. The similarity isn't evidence that one story is the real one and the rest are copies. It's evidence that wildly different human societies, faced with the same terrifying category of disaster, independently arrived at strikingly similar ways of making sense of it. Here's the twist that makes this even stranger. Some of these flood stories may be even more historically specific than scientists once assumed. Researchers studying the Black Sea region found geological evidence of a sudden, massive flood roughly 7,500 years ago, when rising Mediterranean waters broke through into the Black Sea basin, flooding an area the size of a small country in a matter of months. Some historians believe communities who witnessed this event may have carried the memory of it for generations, eventually folding it into the flood narratives that later traveled into the stories we now read in the Bible and in Mesopotamian texts. The myth, in other words, might not just be a metaphor for a category of disaster. In at least one case, it might be a folk memory of something real, reshaped over thousands of years of retelling. So why does this matter to you, sitting here right now, with no flood anywhere near you? Because the instinct that created these myths hasn't gone anywhere. You still tell stories to make sense of disasters too big to fully process. After major hurricanes, earthquakes, or floods today, survivors still describe their experience using the exact same narrative shape: sudden danger, a small group who makes it through, and a changed world afterward. News coverage of modern floods still leans on the same ancient structure: warning, rising water, escape, and a fresh start. You're not so different from the people who first told the story of Unapishtim or Manu. When something threatens to destroy everything you know, your mind still reaches for the same ancient shape of story to hold onto. The flood myth was never really about water. It was about how small, frightened humans, all over the world, in completely different centuries, found a way to survive the unsurvivable, and then turned that survival into a story strong enough to outlast empires, languages, and thousands of years. You've probably heard the story. A great flood covers the earth, and one small group survives to build the world again. But now you know the real answer is far stranger. It was never just one story. It was humanity, everywhere, independently discovering the same truth, that after total loss, there is still a way to begin again.